Hey guys, tonight we're stepping quietly into a room that smells faintly of beeswax and burning gas, where the wallpaper glows a tired amber and a single mirror hangs across from the hearth, catching the last quivering reflection of the fire. You're in a Victorian parlor, late, maybe too late, and as the flames shrink, your own reflection begins to blur. That's when people back then said you should stop looking. They believed something else might look back. You probably wouldn't survive a single evening of 1890s superstition without covering every reflective surface in your house with a doily, a shawl, or maybe the nearest cat. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening right now, tell me your location and what time it is where you are. I love imagining all of you scattered around the world, cozy in different time zones, nodding off to the same story. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand in the half-dark, where every shadow moves like it's trying to whisper. The Victorian home after sunset was a world made of reflections. Gas lamps threw uneven light, flames fluttered, and mirrors picked up the movement, multiplying it until the room seemed alive. It wasn't hard for people to imagine something lurking inside the glass. Some shimmer of personality that didn't belong entirely to them. The Victorians were experts at taking the ordinary and adding just enough mystery to make it uncomfortable. They had mirrors everywhere, ornate gilt ones above fireplaces, full-length pier mirrors in hallways, tiny hand mirrors tucked in vanity drawers. But they didn't necessarily trust them. When night came, the mirrors became too much like eyes, wide, glossy, and waiting. Even the most practical person could get unsettled. The light was too poor, and your reflection too soft. You could see yourself breathe, but not quite recognize your face. Part of the problem was how those mirrors were made. Unlike today's crisp silvered glass, Victorian mirrors used mercury amalgam or tin foil behind a pane, which produced an uneven, slightly liquid quality. The result was something beautiful and vaguely nauseating. Your features seemed to move just after you did, as if your reflection needed a second to catch up. Historians still argue whether this odd delay in optical realism added to the mirror's eerie reputation, or whether people were already primed by folklore to mistrust them. Either way, it made every evening glance a little theatrical. You might imagine yourself after a long day, corset unlaced, hair pinned loose, passing that mirror on your way to bed. The light flickers, your reflection bends, and you swear you see another face shift behind your own. You blink, and it's gone. Maybe it was the gas flame dancing. Maybe it was the faint vibration from a carriage outside. Maybe it was just nerves. But for Victorians, nerves were practically an art form. The late 19th century was a time when people still balanced precariously between religion, folklore, and the dawning confidence of science. Electricity was still more rumor than fact, and so much of the world remained unseen. Microscopic life, radiation, the mysteries of the mind. The mirror sat right at the intersection of fascination and fear. It was a domestic object that behaved like an oracle, offering an image, but not necessarily the truth, and that unsettled them. There were practical reasons to be uneasy too. Gas lamps hissed softly, some leaked toxic fumes. A bad fixture could cause dizziness, hallucinations, or the kind of headache that made you think the room was spinning. And since the Victorians didn't know about carbon monoxide, they blamed everything from ghosts to nervous hysteria. So, if you ever thought your reflection moved on its own, you weren't necessarily losing your mind. You were just being gently poisoned. A comforting thought, really. Still, the connection between mirrors and something beyond the human world ran deep. The old saying that mirrors reflect not just faces, but souls, survived well into the century. When people started dying from cholera, tuberculosis, and other invisible scourges, they sometimes turned to small household rituals for comfort. Covering a mirror wasn't just superstition, it was a soft refusal to invite more death in. You couldn't control disease, but you could control who saw your reflection. Imagine the hush that fell over a home after sunset. Servants stoking the last of the fire, footsteps fading, the mantel clock ticking away. Someone, probably a weary mother or aunt, crosses the room and tosses a shawl over the parlor mirror before going upstairs. It's just habit now. No one questions it aloud, but they all sleep a little better knowing that the thing on the wall won't be staring at them from the dark. There's something paradoxical about it. The Victorians adored surfaces. They polished silver until it gleamed, buffed wood until it glowed, filled their drawing rooms with gleaming brass. Yet the one surface that showed them too clearly was treated with suspicion. It's as though they preferred the world to sparkle, but not to answer back. We might laugh, of course. You, sitting there in the blue light of your phone, surrounded by more reflective glass than any century could have dreamed of. But even you might hesitate if the power went out right now and your screen went dark, showing only your face lit by moonlight. Would you keep staring, or would you very calmly flip it over? The Victorians wouldn't have needed to think twice. They knew the rules of darkness. Don't whistle at night. Don't look into water by candlelight. Don't catch your reflection in the wrong mood. And above all, never, ever trust what you see after sunset. You wake again in that same room, same golden wallpaper, same stubborn hush. But now the focus narrows to that mirror on the wall. The gaslight hums faintly. The last drops of heat from the coals sigh through the grate, and your reflection watches you, as if it's just slightly off tempo. Tonight, we slip into the web of beliefs that shaped those fears, the ancient reflections behind Victorian superstition. The Victorians didn't invent mirror fear. They merely perfected it. Long before anyone wore top hats or tied a cravat, mirrors were already portals of the uncanny. Ancient Greeks told stories about katoptromancy, the art of divination by mirror. A priest would fill a basin with water, lower a polished metal disc into it, and gaze at the shifting surface to see omens of death or fortune. In Roman times, breaking a mirror meant shattering the vessel of your soul, and the penalty was 7 years bad luck, the span of time it supposedly took your spirit to regenerate. Victorians, ever fond of borrowed gravitas, adopted that notion wholesale. They didn't just inherit it, they embroidered it with lace and gloom. In early modern Europe, a mirror was thought to be the most dangerous object in the house during childbirth. Folk wisdom insisted that newborns must not see their reflection until they'd been baptized, lest their unguarded souls slip into the glass and stay there. By the 1800s, such beliefs had evolved into charmingly absurd domestic protocols. Mirrors were covered in nurseries, servants warned to polish only in daylight, and children taught to avert their gaze after dusk. Historians still argue whether these superstitions arose from Christian caution about vanity or from pre-Christian fears about liminality, the idea that mirrors occupy a thin line between worlds. Either way, by the time Victoria took the throne in 1837, the humble mirror had become a sort of household priest, equal parts necessity and taboo. You can picture it, an aging gentleman in a stiff collar lecturing his daughter about modesty, wagging a finger toward her vanity mirror as if it's a gossiping friend. "Too much time with your reflection," he might say, "and you'll forget which side of it you belong on." Meanwhile, That same mirror reflects every family dinner, every candlelit game of cards, every flicker of domestic drama, silently collecting 1,000 tiny images like pressed flowers between glass. The Victorians believed in the moral quality of objects. A well-made chair suggested good character. A dusty mirror hinted at spiritual neglect. Housekeepers' manuals even instructed maids to polish mirrors as one would tend a face, which is either touching or terrifying, depending on your caffeine level. A mirror that gleamed was a moral mirror. One that dulled too quickly might suggest rot, or worse, a presence. And it wasn't only mirrors of silvered glass that provoked unease. Any still surface could serve the same uncanny function. A polished kettle, a rain puddle, even the glint of a window at night. One Scottish folktale that resurfaced in Victorian collections told of a woman who saw her husband's reflection in the wash basin one evening, though he was away at sea. By dawn, the man had drowned. Such tales circulated through drawing room ghost books and penny periodicals, blurring folklore with fact until even rational people admitted to covering the glass for luck. You, walking through one of those gaslit London streets, might see your face doubled in every window, your own ghost keeping pace. Glass was expensive, so most shopfronts used warped panes that bent your reflection, stretching your body into a phantom. If you happened to glance at one during fog or rain, you'd look distorted enough to second-guess your own humanity. One humorist in an 1870s magazine joked that Londoners should never trust their appearance before noon, after fog, or near plate glass. It was a joke, yes, but not a comfortable one. A curious offshoot of this fear was the popularity of witch mirrors. Small convex mirrors hung near doors to repel evil spirits. The idea was that a spirit, seeing its own warped reflection, would be frightened off. It's essentially spiritual slapstick. Evil enters, sees itself, screams, and leaves. You could still find these mirrors in some country houses decades later, a harmless relic of paranoia. By the mid-century, spiritualism gave old mirror lore fresh legs. Mediums spoke of mirrors as thin places, where the barrier between worlds grew sheer after nightfall. That belief wasn't far from ancient Egyptian practice, where polished bronze discs were linked to the goddess Hathor, protector of beauty and the afterlife. Everything loops, doesn't it? Even the Victorians, with their gaslights and steam engines, were haunted by echoes of ancient rituals. The paradox deepened as mirrors became cheaper and more common, thanks to industrial silvering. By the 1850s, even middle-class homes could afford one in every major room. And the more mirrors appeared, the more opportunities there were for something uncanny to happen. A flash of lightning, a candle guttering, a stray reflection catching your own eye at the wrong angle, all enough to jolt the imagination awake. Imagine yourself now, standing before one of those mirrors, holding a candle stub. The flame wobbles, and you swear the reflection hesitates before copying you. You breathe in that familiar coal smoke air, feel the draft through the floorboards, and suddenly you understand why they covered these things. The room feels too full of eyes. Some skeptics at the time mocked the practice. The satirical journal Punch once printed a cartoon of a nervous man taping curtains over every reflective surface, labeled "Protection Against Phantoms." Yet even the skeptics often added, "Best not to tempt fate." You can almost hear the shrug in their tone, just in case. There's a certain comfort in believing the world has hidden rules, that bad luck can be warded off by lace cloths and whispered advice. It made a universe that was otherwise chaotic, disease, death, industrial accidents feel manageable. The mirror fear, in a way, was the Victorians' version of modern screen anxiety. Too much looking, too much self, too much awareness of the ghostly double inside your own reflection. And as gaslight dimmed into true night, they obeyed the oldest rule of all: don't stare too long, or the mirror might learn your name. You're back in that parlor, though the shadows feel a little thicker now. The coals have died down to a faint orange side, and the gas jets tick faintly with every change in air pressure. A few hours have passed. Someone upstairs has long since fallen asleep, and you can hear the slow creak of the old timbers settling. You turn toward the mirror again, and it greets you like an old conspirator. Tonight, you find yourself caught in the age of seances, spirit photography, and the extraordinary notion that mirrors might open directly into the afterlife. By the 1850s, Victorian society had become infatuated with ghosts. Death was everywhere, and decorum demanded that people face it gracefully. Life expectancy hovered around 40, and families lost children to fevers and infections so often that mourning had its own economy. Black dresses, jet jewelry, and elaborate memorial portraits. So, when a movement appeared promising direct communication with the dead, it caught on like gossip. Spiritualism, born in upstate New York with the Fox sisters' famous rappings, crossed the Atlantic and found fertile ground among the tea sets and skepticism of the British middle class. Seances became fashionable entertainment. Parlors that once hosted whist games now arranged chairs around dark tables. Candles were snuffed, hands joined. The medium, usually a woman in modest attire, would murmur invocations, tilt her head, and wait for something unseen to answer. Sometimes it was a tap, sometimes a gust of cold air, sometimes the faint voice of Uncle Thomas complaining about the food in heaven. And there, in the corner of so many of these rooms, stood a mirror, covered or turned to the wall. The reasoning was simple and terrifyingly poetic. Mirrors could act as doors. If you left one uncovered during a seance, the spirit might step through the glass and forget to leave. Manuals on proper seance etiquette even warned hosts to veil all reflective surfaces, lest stray spirits become trapped in the silver. It sounds like Victorian horror fiction, but you'll find references in real journals and letters from the time. Historians still argue whether mediums themselves spread that rule, or whether it grew organically from folklore. Either way, it became standard. Imagine a host in 1872 instructing the maid, draw the curtains, dim the lamp, and please, dear, cover the pier glass. We don't want guests of the wrong sort lingering. The maid nods gravely and drapes a black cloth over the mirror as though tucking in a restless child. And yet, despite the warnings, mirrors fascinated mediums. Some went further, using them deliberately as conduits. One notable figure, Catherine Fox, one of the original Fox sisters, claimed she could see the dead approach through polished surfaces. Another, a London clairvoyant named Fanny Showers, yes, that was really her name, described a ritual in which a spirit would appear behind the sitter's reflection, as though within another world, separated only by breath. You can almost imagine the moment. A flicker of lamplight, a cold draft, a startled gasp, then everyone insisting they'd seen it, because no one wanted to be the dull skeptic who hadn't. To the modern ear, it sounds theatrical, but Victorians didn't experience seances as performances. They treated them like experiments. Scientists and philosophers attended. Sir William Crookes, an esteemed chemist, conducted controlled tests with the medium Florence Cook and claimed to have witnessed materializations, figures emerging from darkness, sometimes seen reflected faintly in a nearby mirror before vanishing. Crooks, for his part, insisted it wasn't a trick. Later investigators said it absolutely was. The debate still lingers, as most good ghost stories do. The Victorians were also discovering new ways to capture images, and that made everything more confusing. The first photographs had an almost magical reputation. Light itself writing on metal plates. When you think about it, photography is just mirror chemistry, the image caught and fixed instead of fleeting. So when early spirit photographers like William Mumler began producing portraits that included ghostly figures, it made perfect sense to people steeped in both superstition and emerging science. The camera became another kind of mirror, one that proved what you saw in the dark. You can almost picture yourself seated for a photograph in 1870, trying not to blink as the exposure drags on, and wondering whether someone might appear behind you. That blend of hope and dread defined the age, a generation that trusted technology but feared what it might reveal. The seance mirror, however, remained its own breed of terror. Some hosts claimed that even covered mirrors sometimes shuddered during contact with spirits. Others said they heard soft tapping from the wall behind. There are recorded accounts, written in the kind of shaky handwriting you can hear trembling through the ink, of people insisting they saw a reflection moving after everyone else had left the room. Were they lying? Possibly. Were they mistaken? Probably. But were they sincere? Absolutely. A particularly eerie story circulated in Manchester newspapers around 1883. A family holding a seance reportedly forgot to cover a mantel mirror. The medium fell into a trance, announced that a visitor was trying to cross, and then screamed when a mist appeared in the glass. The next morning, the mirror supposedly cracked straight across. A local glazier replaced it without incident, but the tale lived on for years. Whether the crack came from temperature or terror, no one knew. It's easy to laugh at that now. You've probably seen mirrors fog up from heat or chill. You know about expansion and pressure. But in a world where science and faith still competed for authority, such incidents carried weight. Even Queen Victoria herself attended private sittings with mediums after Prince Albert's death, though she preferred quiet letter dictations to mirror scrying. Still, imagine the ripple effect. If the Queen found solace in communication with the beyond, who was anyone else to scoff? And so, the mirror remained both forbidden and irresistible. It symbolized self and soul, presence and absence, comfort and peril. You couldn't truly live without it. It was too useful, but you also couldn't fully relax in its gaze. When night fell, you covered it, whispered a polite goodnight to your reflection, and hoped that no one whispered back. As you stand there now, picturing that candlelit parlor, you might feel the same ancient tug, curiosity balanced against caution. You know it's only glass and metal, but you also know how easy it is to see more than what's really there. Maybe that's the most Victorian feeling of all, the quiet suspicion that behind every reflection, someone's waiting their turn to look out. You linger in that candle-scented room, the flame now burning lower, its reflection trembling across the wall like a heartbeat. The Victorians were surrounded by the strange marriage of science and superstition. They were people living halfway between the gaslight and the light bulb, between seances and spectroscopy. It was an age that wanted to explain everything, yet secretly hoped that some things would remain unexplainable. Tonight, you're stepping into that tug of war, the moment when science met the supernatural, and the poor mirror sat awkwardly in the middle, blamed for every odd shimmer and blessed for for every illusion. The century's motto might as well have been progress, but gently. Trains howled through tunnels faster than anyone thought decent. Telegraphs sent words racing across oceans, and microscopes revealed entire jungles in a drop of pond water. But for all their curiosity, the Victorians didn't like what some discoveries implied. If science could explain everything, what happened to mystery? And if mystery died, what happened to faith, poetry, or the cozy thrill of a ghost story told by firelight? The mirror was science's perfect troublemaker. It was an object of pure physics, light bouncing obediently, but it behaved as if it had opinions. You looked at it and saw depth where there was none, movement where there was only reflection. Philosophers couldn't resist turning that into metaphor. The Scottish thinker Thomas Carlyle called mirrors the silent friends of vanity. Meanwhile, experimentalists were busy inventing ways to make reflections bend, split, and multiply. Enter John Henry Pepper, a chemist and showman who gave the Victorians one of their most famous illusions, Pepper's ghost. In 1862, he discovered that by placing a large sheet of glass at an angle and illuminating a hidden actor, he could make a transparent figure appear on stage. Audiences gasped as spirits materialized and vanished, sometimes walking straight through solid walls. You could almost hear the collective thought, so that's how ghosts work. And yet, knowing the trick only made it more alluring. Historians still argue whether illusions like Pepper's weakened belief in the supernatural or encouraged it. After all, a ghost made by science is still a ghost, just better lit. The Victorians adored the feeling of being fooled safely, the way modern viewers love horror films. The difference was that they didn't always leave their fear at the theater. Back home, the same principle of reflection that Pepper used to conjure ghosts made domestic mirrors seem even more suspicious. Imagine standing in a hallway lined with mirrors, a fashionable trend by the 1870s, seeing yourself echoed into infinity. The rational mind might say, "Ah, that's simple optics." The tired, gaslight-poisoned mind might say, "There are too many of me, and one of them isn't behaving." Scientists, of course, tried to calm the public. The newly coined discipline of psychology began studying perception. There were papers about mirror madness, cases of individuals convinced that their reflections had independent will. Doctors prescribed rest cures, tonics, and in one particularly cruel experiment, simply removing all mirrors from a patient's home. The result? They often got better, or at least, they stopped reporting that their reflection whispered their name. And still, science couldn't entirely wash away the chill. A reflection is an uninvited double. It's you, but reversed. For Victorians who prized moral order and social hierarchy, that inversion was unnerving. Everything had its proper side, its proper rank. To see oneself flit was to glimpse rebellion in miniature. The fun part is how the language of optics crept into everyday talk. Newspapers spoke of the mirror of the soul, or a mirror held to society. And it wasn't metaphorical fluff. It was literal fascination. Light itself seemed magical. Physicists like James Clerk Maxwell were proving that light was an electromagnetic wave, something that could travel through space without any physical medium. To the untrained ear, that sounded exactly like a ghost, an invisible presence moving through air, invisible yet measurable. One earnest London journalist wrote that perhaps the dead communicate by a form of light not yet discovered. You can imagine a reader finishing that sentence, glancing uneasily at their hallway mirror and pulling the curtains a bit tighter. The contradictions piled up like coal dust. Telegraph lines were carrying disembodied voices. the phonograph began replaying them. For the first time in human history, you could hear someone speak after they died, thanks to a machine. Mirrors reflected their faces. Phonographs repeated their laughter. Technology and haunting became almost the same thing. There's a famous photograph of a Victorian scientist demonstrating early X-rays, his subject's bones glowing faintly on a screen. Onlookers described it as a glimpse beyond flesh. You can bet that somewhere, someone wondered if the same energy could reveal ghosts in mirrors. A few even tried. Amateur inventors tinkered with mirrors coated in new chemicals, hoping to capture spectral images. None succeeded, but their notebooks read like early science fiction. Still, the average household wasn't equipped for experiments. What they had were gaslights, often unreliable and always moody. When a flame dipped low, reflections would warp and stretch across wallpaper, patterned with vines and cherubs. You'd turn your head, swear you saw movement, and feel a pulse of cold right through your corset. Later, you'd tell yourself it was draft, or indigestion, or the cat. Always the cat. Even writers who prided themselves on realism admitted the glass could lie. Charles Dickens, who was fascinated by optical illusions, wrote about ghostly doubles and people haunted by their own shadows. He knew the mirror was just a trick of light, but he also knew how easily light tricked people's hearts. And maybe that's the real tension of Victorian modernity. Science explaining the how, but never quite soothing the why. You can measure the reflection, calculate the angles, trace the photons. Yet at 2 in the morning, when your reflection seems to breathe slightly out of sync, you remember that you're a creature of instinct before intellect. You don't need proof to feel uneasy. So you stand there, watching that faint light ripple across the mirror's surface. You tell yourself it's only physics, only glass and mercury. But if you stare too long, something primitive stirs. Something that doesn't care about Maxwell's equations. The rational world may have arrived, but the old world hasn't quite left. It's right there, behind the glass, smiling, patient, waiting for the light to dim just a little more. You wake again in that same parlor, but now the curtains have been drawn, the clock has stopped, and someone has died upstairs. The air feels thicker, quieter. You can hear your own heartbeat in the hush. A mirror leans against the wall, draped in black crepe. You don't know who passed away, but the ritual of grief has begun, and part of it, an oddly practical superstition, concerns that covered glass. This is the heart of the old custom, mirror covering at death. In Victorian England, death was not a private event. It was a household performance, choreographed with precision. Mourning had its dress codes, its etiquette manuals, even its approved time frames. 2 years for a husband, 6 months for a cousin, and so on. Houses of mourning were marked by drawn blinds and muffled doorbells. Yet one of the most telling rituals required no announcement. Every mirror in the house was to be covered. To you, it might sound quaint, even charmingly gothic, but to Victorians, it was deadly serious. Mirrors were believed to be dangerous in a house where death had occurred, too reflective, too alive. The reasoning was twofold. First, that the soul of the deceased might get trapped in the mirror while trying to find its way to the afterlife. And second, that anyone who caught their reflection too soon might invite death to mistake them for the departed. Neither theory was particularly comforting. Imagine it. You've lost someone dear. You're dressed in heavy black crepe that smells faintly of dye and dust. The house feels haunted, not by ghosts, but by etiquette. Every surface has been dim, curtains drawn, mirrors veiled, clocks stopped at the hour of death. You move through rooms that no longer gleam. The mirrors once so proud of their shine, have become blind. It's as if the house itself has closed its eyes in respect. Historians still argue whether this tradition began as a spiritual safeguard or a psychological courtesy. Some scholars think it originated from Jewish mourning customs, where mirrors are covered during Shiva to discourage vanity and focus on grief. Others trace it to earlier European folklore, where reflections were thought to distract the soul from departing peacefully. Either way, the custom took deep root in Victorian soil, fertilized by sentimentality and fear. Queen Victoria's own prolonged mourning after Prince Albert's death in 1861 reinforced every superstition about decorum and death. Her mourning lasted 40 years, and though she probably didn't personally drape mirrors daily, her obsession with memorialization, the jet jewelry, the black dresses, the posthumous portraits, set a tone for the empire. Everyone wanted to grieve properly, and that meant dimming both light and reflection. Covering a mirror became an act of mercy as well as tradition. The newly dead were thought to linger in confusion. The last thing they needed was to catch sight of themselves and panic. A soul, seeing its reflection, may tarry too long, warned one etiquette guide from 1878. The phrasing sounds polite, but you can sense the dread beneath it. The fear of a soul that won't leave, that might become a ghost. It wasn't only the dead who were protected. The living, too, needed shielding from themselves. A mourner, pale and sleepless, might glimpse their face and mistake it for an apparition. With every mirror covered, grief could remain inward, safely contained. Without mirrors, the world stopped insisting on appearances. In some rural areas, people took the ritual further. They would turn the mirror to face the wall instead of covering it, or even remove it from the house entirely. In Scotland, some families placed a sprig of rosemary on top of the shrouded mirror to sweeten the glass. The logic was tenderly absurd. If the soul brushed past, it would smell something pleasant. One odd little superstition warned against cleaning or uncovering a mirror too soon after a death. Let the glass sleep, people said. To polish it while mourning was considered indecent, almost an invitation for the next tragedy. You can imagine the poor housemaid nervously dusting around a mirror, trying not to disturb it. There were even whispered stories about those who disobeyed the rule. Young women who looked too soon saw a shadow behind them and fainted dead away. It's all very melodramatic, which of course means it was quintessentially Victorian. But underneath the lace and gloom, the custom had a certain emotional intelligence. Death was intimate, and so was the mirror. Both forced people to confront the self, and when grief was fresh, that was the last thing anyone wanted. In a way, covering the mirror was less about ghosts and more about kindness, protecting yourself from the sight of your own continuing life. You step closer to the draped mirror now, hearing only the muffled tick of the stopped clock. You lift one corner of the fabric. Dust motes rise. Beneath it, the glass gleams faintly in the dark, a smudge of reflected lamplight, waiting. You could pull the cloth away and look. No one's here to stop you, but you hesitate. There's something reverent about leaving it alone, as though the glass itself deserves to rest. This fear of mirrors in death didn't stay confined to Britain. Through colonial channels, it spread across the empire, to India, to the Caribbean, even to Africa, where it mingled with local beliefs about spirits and reflections. The British might have brought railroads and bureaucrats, but they also exported a good bit of paranoia. The irony, of course, is that the Victorians adored memorial imagery. They kept lockets of hair, photographs of corpses posed as if sleeping, and even death masks, literal molds of the deceased's face. They wanted remembrance, but on their terms. The mirror's uncontrolled reflection felt too raw, too unpredictable. You could stage a photograph, but you couldn't stage your reflection. So they covered it. Out of fear, yes, but also out of love. It's oddly moving, isn't it? This idea that even the household mirror, so central to vanity and decorum, could become a mourner, that the house itself might grieve alongside its people. When you think of it that way, it stops being superstition and starts sounding almost poetic. You lower the fabric again, letting it settle over the glass. The air feels a little easier now, as though some quiet rule has been observed. Somewhere beyond the parlor door, life continues. Footsteps creak. Someone coughs. The clock will be wound again eventually, but for now, the mirror sleeps. And so, perhaps, should you. You find yourself still in that heavy Victorian house, where the black crepe drapes ripple slightly with every draft, and the air tastes faint of candle smoke and lavender. Someone has drawn the curtains tighter, yet there's another kind of light in the glow of superstition, sharper than candle flame. You can feel it in the way people whisper, as if afraid to disturb invisible company. Tonight, you're going to learn why Victorians thought mirrors didn't just reflect spirits, they could invite them. By the mid-19th century, spiritualism had seeped into drawing rooms like gaslight. Seances were the new parlor entertainment, part religion, part theater, and entirely Victorian. The promise was deliciously simple. Through a medium, you can speak to your dead loved ones. You didn't need to visit a church or graveyard, just a quiet room, a few candles, maybe a silver bell, and the willingness to believe. Mirrors, of course, soon found their way into the act. If they could show the living world, surely they could reveal what waited beyond. And so, with the optimism only the Victorians could muster, people began gazing into mirrors, not to check their hair, but to glimpse eternity. One of the strangest trends came from an American stage magician turned mystic named John Pepper. Around the 1860s, his invention, known as Pepper's Ghost, used mirrors and light to project ghostly illusions on stage. Theater audiences screamed and applauded as spirits shimmered before their eyes. The trick became so famous that it accidentally lent credibility to spiritualism itself. If glass could conjure phantoms in the theater, why not in the home? And so people began to darken rooms, angle mirrors, and wait. Spirit mirrors, they called them. Black frame, sometimes smoked with candle soot to dim the shine. They were supposed to make it easier to see what one London medium described as the faint light of the next world. You sit with them now, cross-legged at a seance table. The medium, a stern woman in lace cuffs, warns everyone to keep silent. A faint hum fills the room as someone whispers a prayer. Then she turns the mirror toward the wall, face hidden, as if to test your nerve. They'll come when they're ready, she says. The words are simple, but they make your skin prickle. Historians still argue whether these mirror seances were genuinely believed or more like entertainment, something between a parlor game and emotional therapy. The Victorian heart was divided neatly between faith and science, and spiritualism became the bridge between them. You could attend a seance, debate the afterlife, and then go home and read the Times. One mainstream fact remains: the craze was massive. By 1870, London alone had dozens of professional mediums, many using mirrors as part of their apparatus. Even Mary Todd Lincoln, the American First Lady, hosted seances in the White House after her son's death. The appeal was obvious. Death was everywhere: cholera, childbirth, war, and the Victorians were nothing if not sentimental. A mirror that promised a second glance at someone lost was irresistible. There's a lesser-known tidbit that makes the whole thing even stranger. A few inventors tried to mechanize spirit mirrors. In 1878, A man named William Mumler, who also claimed to photograph ghosts, patented a psychic camera mirror, a device meant to capture reflected spirits on glass. It was part lens, part wishful thinking. Unsurprisingly, no ghosts were recorded, though one patent reviewer reportedly said, "If spirits exist, they deserve privacy." You can't help but smirk at that line. Leave it to a bureaucrat to protect ghostly data rights before the internet was even imagined. Still, many Victorians swore the experiences were real. Some described seeing faces appear briefly beside their own reflections. Others claimed the mirror grew dark and deep, as if it had become a pond. One woman in Bath wrote in her diary that her deceased sister's face appeared in a parlor mirror, smiling, though her lips did not move. She fainted immediately after writing the entry, and her handwriting changed afterward, a fact which no one has ever explained. But of course, human perception is fragile, especially by candlelight. Scholars today suspect most of these visions came from a mix of grief, optical illusion, and what one psychologist later called expectant perception. You see what you hope to see. Yet that doesn't make the experience less powerful. In the dim quiet of a Victorian home, where gaslight flickered like breath, a mirror could easily seem like a threshold. Some spiritualists even taught mirror gazing as a nightly discipline. Sit before a darkened mirror, stare steadily, and let your mind slide away from this world. You weren't supposed to blink too much or shift your gaze. After a few minutes, the face you saw might morph slightly, an effect we now call the Troxler illusion. But they didn't know about neurology. They called it the thinning of the veil. You can imagine how unsettling that must have felt. The longer you stared, the less yourself you seem. And for Victorians already living in a world of gaslit fog and mortality, the feeling of slipping between realities was both terrifying and oddly comforting. Of course, not everyone approved. Church leaders warned that mirrors were unholy portals, devices through which demons might mimic the dead. Even the skeptical newspapers printed cautionary stories. In one account from the Illustrated London News, a man supposedly became obsessed after a seance mirror winked at him. He covered every mirror in his house for the rest of his life. Still, curiosity won out. The Victorians couldn't resist the blend of fear and fascination. They loved nothing more than turning dread into ritual. And so, after dinner, in hundreds of respectable homes, people dimmed the lamps, faced their own reflections, and waited to see what might blink back. Now, picture yourself there. You lean closer to the mirror, breath fogging the glass. The room is so quiet, you can hear the clock tick 2 rooms away. The flame trembles. For just a heartbeat, you think you see movement, not behind you, but inside the reflection. A trick of the light, you tell yourself, or maybe, just maybe, something looking back. The lamps have burned lower now. Somewhere in that sprawling Victorian house, a clock chimes midnight. A sound that feels softer, slower, more uncertain. You're still in the parlor, but the seance has ended, and what lingers in the air isn't proof or revelation, only a delicate unease. The mirror stands there again, no longer draped, just quietly waiting. You might think the story would fade here, into superstition, but instead, it deepens. Tonight, you learn how science, that new Victorian obsession, collided with folklore, and how even the most rational minds began to fear the mirror's strange chemistry. You see, the Victorians were terrified of a lot of new things. Germs, telegraphs, train speeds over 40 miles per hour. Yet the mirror, an object older than civilization itself, became newly mysterious in the 19th century, precisely because people finally understood how it worked, or at least They thought they did. Early in the century, mirrors were still rare and expensive, their surfaces made from polished metal or fragile glass, backed with tin and mercury. The process was toxic. Silvering a mirror meant brushing mercury amalgam behind glass, a job so dangerous that factory workers often went blind or suffered hallucinations. The term "mad as a hatter" could easily have applied to mirror makers too. It's an odd historical fact that every Victorian parlor mirror contained, quite literally, a thin layer of poison. You'd look into your own face, and behind it, sealed in the glass, lay a whisper of mercury vapor. Small wonder the object began to seem haunted. The newer chemical method, using silver nitrate, was safer, but no less uncanny. The liquid silver had to be carefully poured over glass, forming a gleaming surface almost by magic. Watching it happen was like watching a reflection grow out of nothing. And for Victorians, people who still half believed in alchemy, this transformation of matter carried an almost spiritual weight. Historians still argue whether this fascination fed the superstition or merely reflected it. Pardon the pun. Some say that once people saw the mirror born in liquid form, they began to imagine it as a living thing, capable of absorbing, storing, or even remembering what it saw. That's the fringe tidbit for you. A few experimental scientists in the 1870s actually speculated that mirrors might hold onto light impressions the way photographic plates did. The theory was nicknamed optical haunting. If a camera could trap a moment, why couldn't a mirror? One London journal even published a pseudoscientific essay titled, "Does the Glass Dream of What It Has Seen?" which feels like something written by a poet in a lab coat. You can almost picture it. A group of serious men with fine mustaches standing around a mirror in a gaslit lab, waiting to see if yesterday's reflection would appear again. Spoiler, it didn't, but they probably lost sleep over it anyway. This was the golden age of pseudoscience. Phrenology mapped the skull for morality. Mesmerism promised invisible energy fields. And photography hinted that light itself might carry souls. In such an atmosphere, it was easy to see the mirror as more than just a household object. It became a vessel for both science and superstition, a kind of liminal tool that bridged the physical and the spectral. Even mainstream scientists were drawn into the metaphor. One physicist, Sir David Brewster, wrote that a mirror reverses but does not falsify, preserves but does not own. He meant it as optics, but to Victorians, it sounded almost theological. If the mirror did not own what it showed, who did? You lean closer to that mercury-backed glass, trying to imagine how it felt to live at the crossroads of faith and invention. On one side, gaslight and factories. On the other, seances and superstition. Every household mirror was like a boundary marker, half technology, half talisman. And there were darker worries too. Mercury exposure was known, even then, to cause trembling, anxiety, and paranoia. Some Victorians began to wonder whether the fear of mirrors after dark might not be psychological at all, but chemical, a subtle poisoning that made people uneasy around reflective surfaces. It's a chillingly modern theory. You might laugh, but consider how often a haunted house is later found to have toxic mold or carbon monoxide. Sometimes ghosts wear lab coats. Still, for most Victorians, the science only deepened the mystery. Knowing how a mirror worked didn't make it less strange. It made it more so. They could measure light, explain reflection, even coat the glass with precision. But none of that answered the essential question. Where does the image go when you look away? You stare at your own face in the imagined glass. For a moment, the reflection holds perfectly still, then ripples slightly, as if stirred from behind. The candle flame wavers. Your reflection's eyes seem to linger just half a second too long before blinking with. You remind yourself it's only imagination, the sort of trick every Victorian child grew up fearing. There's a delightful absurdity to it all. The way the era's most rational minds ended up making their nightmares more sophisticated. The old folklore of the mirror stealing your soul was transformed into optical theory, complete with equations. They couldn't exorcise the fear, so they quantified it. And yet, the charm of it remains. You can't help admiring the Victorians for trying to understand something so ordinary in such extraordinary ways. Their curiosity bordered on romance. Every new discovery about reflection or photography made them feel a little closer to eternity. And in a century obsessed with both death and progress, that was the perfect contradiction. If you listen closely, you might almost hear one of them saying, "Science has revealed the soul, but please cover the mirror after dark." You smile. It's the kind of sentence that sums up the age. Curious, poetic, just slightly unhinged. The mirror before you seems to brighten. The faint light within it, steady and cold. You reach out a hand, fingertips hovering over the surface. It feels wrong to touch, as though the glass itself might be awake. You pull back and let the darkness settle again. Somewhere beyond this room, another scientist is polishing his instruments. Another housemaid is drawing a curtain over a parlor mirror. Another widow is whispering a name into her pillow. The world outside hums with invention and grief, and every pane of glass holds a little of both. The mirror keeps its secrets, and the Victorians, for all their progress, keep fearing the reflection that knows them better than they know themselves. The candle's gone out now. The room is darker, but not entirely black. There's that soft silver glow that never quite disappears when mirrors are near. You can feel the faintest hum in the air, like the way a room feels after music stops. But before the silence settles, the Victorians would have recognized that hum instantly. They had a word for it: presence. Tonight, you drift from science to society, how mirrors ruled not just the parlor, but the human soul. In a world obsessed with propriety and perfection, the mirror became both the stage and the judge. And after sunset, when shadows softened the human face, it judged different. During daylight, a Victorian mirror was a symbol of virtue. It belonged in bright drawing rooms and clean halls, where polite ladies adjusted their bonnets and gentlemen checked their whiskers before dinner. Beauty wasn't vanity exactly. It was moral evidence. Smooth skin meant self-discipline. Calm eyes meant a well-governed spirit. The Victorians adored that illusion of control. But after sunset, the same mirror seemed to turn traitor. Candlelight distorted everything. Faces blurred, cheeks hollowed, eyes gleamed like small wet marbles. The soft imperfections that gaslight revealed looked almost sinful. A woman who admired herself by day might recoil from her own reflection at night. That, more than any ghost story, is why so many began covering their mirrors after dusk. One etiquette book from 1864 advised that the truly modest woman does not study her face by candlelight. That's not science. That's moral panic dressed up as household advice. You can almost hear the anxious tone of a culture terrified that the line between virtue and vanity might blur like a reflection in low light. Historians still argue whether Victorian modesty was genuine belief or just a performance for society's gaze. Probably both. But mirrors made the performance impossible to escape. They reflected not just how people looked, but how they thought they were supposed to look. And that pressure never slept. Here's your mainstream fact. By the late 19th century, England was producing more mirrors than any other country in the world. Entire factories in Birmingham and Manchester were devoted to turning out the glass ornaments that filled middle-class homes. For a family climbing the social ladder, owning a large mirror wasn't luxury. It was proof you'd arrived. But there's a smaller, stranger fact, too. In poorer neighborhoods, women sometimes hung polished tins or even small pieces of broken mirror on the wall, calling them truth glasses. They used them not for beauty, but for reassurance, a way to check that their faces still existed after long factory shifts. It's heartbreakingly practical. Mirrors as proof of being human in a mechanized age. You walk through one of those narrow London alleys now, imagining flickering lamp bouncing off a shard of glass nailed to a brick wall. Someone's face appears, then vanishes. It's like watching identity itself blink in and out of existence. Meanwhile, in fashionable parlors uptown, mirrors became instruments of etiquette warfare. Young debutantes were taught mirror manners, how to glance without seeming vain. A proper lady could adjust her curls using only peripheral vision. Never hold the mirror longer than a moment, one guide warned, lest it hold you in return. There it is again, that faint superstition hiding under decorum. You can't help but smile at how seriously they took it. Imagine being afraid of looking too long, because your reflection might look back harder. That's the Victorian paradox. Propriety and paranoia sharing the same glass. But mirrors weren't just tools for vanity. They were windows into moral self-surveillance. A good Victorian household had rules for everything, including reflection. Children were told to avoid staring too long or making faces in mirrors after dark, for mischief seen thrice may stick. It was part theology, part parenting strategy, and entirely effective at producing generations of anxious adults. And yet, mirrors also offered forbidden freedom. In a world where gender roles were strict, the reflection was private space. A woman could practice expressions she'd never dare show in public: anger, amusement, boredom. Some even wrote about feeling their truest selves only when the house was dark and no one could see but the mirror. You can imagine the scandal if anyone had found out that a respectable widow was having quiet conversations with her reflection. There's one diary entry from 1881 that captures this beautifully. A woman wrote, "By candlelight I looked not at myself, but at the person I might have been." That's not vanity, that's existential crisis with a corset. Over time, that eerie intimacy made people nervous. The mirror had stopped being merely decorative. It had become a confidant, maybe even a rival. After all, it could reveal what manners tried to hide: tired eyes, secret smiles, moments of loneliness. By day, it flattered. By night, it told the truth. You lean closer again, peering into that imagined glass, where your own outline flickers softly. In gaslight, everything wavers. For a brief second, you see someone else, an older version of you, perhaps, or just a trick of shadow. The Victorians would have had no doubt. A mirror by night shows not what is, but what waits. It's such a deliciously eerie phrase, isn't it? And yet, it was meant earnestly. They truly believed that reflections after sunset carried an emotional charge, that mirrors, like people, grew weary with the day and began to reveal the soul beneath the skin. You can almost sympathize. Think about it. In an age before electric light, your reflection was never the same twice. Every flickering candle, every shifting ember reshaped your face. The Victorians didn't fear their mirrors because of superstition alone. They feared them because for the first time in history, the mirror was always watching. By day, It upheld the fiction of moral perfection. By night, it whispered the truth, and so the habit stuck. Mirrors were covered not only to guard against ghosts or trapped souls, but to silence the disobedient witness that saw too much. You take one last glance into the dim reflection before turning away. Somewhere behind that silvered surface, an older age still watches you, prim, proper, and quietly terrified of itself. The house seems to breathe now. The old walls expand with the night air. The wood creaks faintly, and somewhere a mirror hums its silver tune. You're beginning to understand. For the Victorians, this wasn't just fear of a shiny surface. It was a philosophy of reflection itself, and in their endless need to explain everything through moral order, they even found a way to turn that fear into ritual hygiene. This time, you're standing in a narrow upstairs hallway. The wallpaper is a dizzying floral pattern, and every few feet hangs another small mirror. Gilt frames, oval frames, little hand mirrors resting on tables like sleeping eyes. But all of them have one thing in common. They're turned inward. No one wants to see themselves at this hour. Let's start with the most respectable reason: cleanliness. Victorians adored sanitation, or at least the appearance of it. They were the first to build entire social movements around soap. They boiled sheets, scrubbed staircases, and wrote sentimental poems about cleanliness. Yet one area remained unspoken: the moral hygiene of the home's reflection. In countless etiquette manuals, you'll find warnings like, "A spotless mirror betokens a spotless mind," or "Smears on the glass reveal disorder of the soul." It's unintentionally poetic, but there's that same undercurrent of fear. If a mirror could reveal your face so faithfully, what else might it be showing? Here's your mainstream fact for tonight. Victorian homes were often dimly lit, relying on mirrors to double whatever little light came from lamps and fires. A polished mirror wasn't just vanity, it was illumination. People placed mirrors strategically near chandeliers or fireplaces to magnify brightness, sometimes saving an entire household's candle budget. So when night came and mirrors were covered, rooms actually darkened. The ritual fear literally extinguished light. But beneath that practicality lay something strange. The Victorians thought mirrors absorbed more than just light. Some even claimed that a mirror which reflected too many people, say a busy hallway glass, could grow tired and begin showing distorted images. There's your quirky tidbit for the evening: a weary mirror, as if furniture could develop a bad mood. Of course, a few scientists tried to correct this. "Mirrors do not grow tired," lectured one professor in the London Mechanic. "Only those who gaze into them." Yet despite the rational protests, superstition won. You can't entirely blame them. Mirrors do behave oddly after sunset. Reflections deepen, distort, and flicker. The human brain mistranslates shadows into motion. You think you see something move in the corner, but it's only your imagination trying to fill the dark. The Victorians just gave that sensation a name: the stirring of the silver. Historians still argue whether this phrase began as poetry or diagnosis. Some say it referred to the faint movement of mercury in the old glass. Others believe it was an early term for eye strain. Either way, it sounded mystical enough to endure. If you see the silver stir, one folk rhyme warned, close your eyes, lest it remember. You can picture it: children lying awake, wondering if the mirror by the wardrobe is quietly watching. No wonder parents covered them. It wasn't just for superstition, it was for sleep. But the mirror's influence stretched even into medicine. Victorians were terrified of sleeplessness, or night waking, which they believed led to madness. Doctors began advising patients to remove mirrors from bedrooms altogether. One 1887 medical pamphlet declared, "A mirror catching lamplight in a restless room may irritate the nerves and induce nervous fevers." You almost want to frame that sentence. It's both absurd and perfectly true. And maybe they were onto something. Modern sleep researchers have noted that reflections in low light can trigger micro-alertness. The human brain evolved to notice faces, even our own, in the dark. So the mirror beside a Victorian's bed wasn't just eerie, it was biologically stressful. They didn't have neuroscience, so they called it mirror fever. That's your open scholarly debate. Tonight, were Victorians actually experiencing mild mercury exposure and optical anxiety? Or was it all cultural theater? Did the fear come from chemistry, psychology, or morality? The arguments go in circles, like reflections chasing each other across glass. You turn and look down the hallway again. The mirrors are faintly glowing in the half-dark, as though they've been absorbing lamplight all day and are now exhaling it. The thought feels ridiculous and true at the same time. You take a step closer to one. Its frame is carved with ivy leaves, and at the bottom, a small crack snakes across the glass. It catches your reflection and splits it delicately in two. Victorians hated cracks. They thought them prophetic, omens of discontinuity. In one London household guide, a broken mirror was described as a moral accident demanding restitution. That meant not only replacing the mirror, but offering a small prayer or good deed to counterbalance the omen. You can imagine a maid donating her weekly wages just because she dropped a hand mirror. It's strangely moving how everything, even accidents, became moralized. To them, nothing was meaningless. Crack in the glass might represent a crack in the soul. A smudge might mean carelessness. A lingering reflection might imply vanity. And so, every act of cleaning, covering, or turning away became a kind of confession. You wipe a finger along the imaginary glass, half expecting it to hum beneath your touch. Maybe the Victorians weren't afraid of the mirror at all. Maybe they were afraid of what it revealed when everything else was stripped away. Picture a woman blowing out her last candle, the room going dark, except for one glint of reflected light. She hesitates, unsure whether to cover it, because to leave it uncovered means she'll see herself in the dark, and that's the most dangerous sight of all. You can almost hear her whisper the old saying, "Glass remembers faces." Then the soft sound of cloth sliding over silver, and the darkness deepens. You smile to yourself, tucked into the quiet of your own time, and realize that maybe the Victorians weren't wrong. Mirrors do have long memories of light, of faces, of fears passed down like family heirlooms. And here you are, still peering in, centuries later, hoping to see something more than your reflection looking back. The house settles further, and you notice that the floorboards now creak with a softer rhythm, as though the wood itself is breathing. Shadows stretch across the walls, lengthening toward the mirrors, which seem to darken under the weight of expectation. By now, you've begun to see why Victorians feared mirrors after sunset, not just as superstitions or moral warnings, but as objects that transformed ordinary rooms into realms of ambiguity, where light, grief, stretched a mirror, a lazy Cinderella, waking to this taste of calm and confidence. And it's worth remembering that mirrors were expensive luxury items. A large, polished glass in the parlor or bedroom was often one of the household's most treasured possessions. They were framed in gilt, carved wood, or even exotic materials like ivory. Families displayed them prominently, yet always with caution. To leave a mirror uncovered after dark was considered both imprudent and, some claim, dangerous. You can almost imagine the gentle admonishment, "Do not tempt the spirits," or your own reflection by leaving that glass free. By the late Victorian period, mirrors had also become tools of social observation. Ladies and gentlemen used them to practice proper posture, gestures, and facial expressions before social gatherings. The mirror, in other words, acted as both guide and judge. At night, the lessons continued in private, but here the stakes were psychological, not social. A dim candle might exaggerate a wrinkle, a shadow might distort the jawline. The Victorians interpreted these imperfections not just as flaws, but as messages. Historians still argue how seriously people believed these nocturnal warnings. Were they genuinely afraid of supernatural consequences? Or was it a blend of anxiety, etiquette, and imagination? Probably both. The mirror's power came from its dual role. It reflected the self and the unknown. Some fringe beliefs took this further. There are accounts from rural England describing mirrors catching the soul of a recently deceased family member if uncovered too soon. The object wasn't malevolent. It was misunderstood. People were instructed to veil mirrors at funerals, just as they would cover clocks or stop the house bells. The entire household operated under a kind of ceremonial hush in which mirrors were participants in mourning. And then there were the ghost photographs. Spirit photography, which gained popularity in the 1860s and 1870s, used mirrors and other reflective surfaces to create faint apparitions. These images were often double exposures, but they convinced countless Victorians that mirrors could capture souls. If a photograph could immortalize a ghost, why couldn't a mirror at home harbor one? By now, you probably feel the tension in the Victorian approach. A house filled with objects that were beautiful, useful, and potentially dangerous. Mirrors reflected light and identity, but also fear. Candles flickered and threw moving shadows. Floorboards creaked, and the imagination, trained in superstition, filled in the rest. One Victorian journal remarked, "A mirror is innocent until it is seen in the dark." That's as close to a bedtime warning as any mid-century etiquette manual offered. You tiptoe past a long pier glass, noting how your own reflection seems slightly taller in the dim candlelight. You're acutely aware of posture now, even at this quiet hour. Maybe the Victorians were onto something. Self-awareness in a room alive with shadows and reflection could easily become apprehension. There's a delightful contradiction here. Mirrors were meant to clarify, yet they confused. They offered knowledge of appearance, but encouraged speculation about the unseen. A single glance might show the mundane reality of your face, or hint at a specter hovering just beyond your line of sight. And the Victorians loved this tension. They could rationalize the mirror scientifically during the day and fear it mystically at night. Some houses took it even further. A mirror might be veiled permanently in a bedroom where someone had recently died, only to be uncovered weeks later when the grieving period ended. Families approached this ritual with meticulous care. One surviving account describes a servant carefully draping cloth over a pier glass, while the mistress murmured, "May it remember only kindness." The act is strangely tender, a combination of superstition, etiquette, and compassion. You run your hand along a polished surface now, imagining that old crepe cloth sliding over it. The mirror waits patiently, neither judging nor forgiving. It simply is, a reflective surface holding countless histories, fears, and fleeting imaginations. Finally, as the candle sputters its last, you take a step back. You see your own reflection for a brief instant before the shadows reclaim the room. It's easy to imagine why, after sunset, Victorians preferred mirrors, covered, draped, or turned to the wall, because in the hush of night, with imagination and grief entwined, the mirror is never just glass. And as you leave the parlor, it seems almost sentient, patient, waiting for the next observer, brave enough to look too closely. The night deepens. Footsteps echo softly on the wooden stairs, though you know you are alone. Somewhere, a clock ticks its slow insistence, and you can almost hear the whisper of Victorian etiquette brushing against your ears. Cover the mirrors after dark. You follow the sound down the hallway, pausing at each reflective surface, noticing how the candlelight, or what little remains of it, splits across frames like silver threads. Tonight, you're moving beyond superstition into the realm of psychology, exploring why mirrors became agents of unease as much as vanity. You might think fear of mirrors after sunset was solely about spirits, but it was also about identity. The Victorians, obsessed with self-improvement and social appearance, lived in a world where every action was scrutinized by society, by moral codes, and, as it turned out, by reflective glass. The mirror became a quiet arbiter. At night, with gaslight flickering, your reflection might not match the disciplined image you had cultivated by day. This mismatch could be profoundly unsettling. Mainstream fact: Victorian psychologists, then a nascent field, began noting that people often saw their faces differently in dim light, sometimes perceiving expressions that weren't there. They called it mirror fatigue or twilight distortion, a term we now might explain through the brain's tendency to exaggerate low-light stimuli. But the fringe details are more intriguing. Some spiritualist pamphlets suggested that mirrors could amplify emotional energy, capturing fleeting thoughts and anxieties, and in the wrong hands, even transmitting them to another observer. Imagine a glass that remembers not just your reflection, but your internal state. You shiver. Historians still argue whether these claims were genuinely believed or simply theatrical embellishments. Perhaps it was both. Victorians loved to blur the line between science and magic, turning ordinary objects into conduits for curiosity, fear alike. The phenomenon wasn't limited to private homes. Public spaces like theaters, hotels, and even railway stations featured mirrors designed to manipulate light. You step into a hypothetical Victorian hotel corridor. Polished mirrors stretch along the walls, reflecting lantern light and multiplying shadows. The effect is eerie. Even if no ghost exists, your mind fills the gaps with movement, whispers, possibilities. Even literature capitalized on this. Authors like Wilkie Collins and Mary Elizabeth Braddon wrote scenes where mirrors became instruments of tension, revealing not merely a character's face, but hidden guilt, suppressed desire, or lurking terror. The glass, in fiction as in life, became a silent witness, a moral compass, and the psychological trigger all at once. Then there's the domestic application. Household guides advised placing mirrors strategically to improve room lighting, but also cautioned against using them in bedrooms at night. One manual noted that even a small mirror could disturb delicate nerves if viewed when the eye is fatigued or the candle dim. It's part etiquette, part proto-psychology, part gentle horror. You imagine a young Victorian lady sitting up in bed with a faint candle, staring into a small hand mirror. She adjusts her hair nervously, and in the wavering light, her face seems not quite hers. Perhaps it's the flame, perhaps it's the exhaustion, perhaps it's her imagination. Yet the effect is real enough to warrant covering the glass, just to be safe. There are accounts of families keeping mirrors covered for weeks after an illness, believing that exposure too soon could provoke nightmares, nervous disorders, or moral lapses. A small silver-framed mirror might seem innocuous during the day, but at night, it was capable of disturbing a household's equilibrium. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some Victorians believe that if a mirror reflected an argument or emotional outburst, it could remember it, subtly influencing future behavior. A tense reflection might embed tension into the glass itself, ready to remind or provoke at the next glance. Think of it as proto-psychic furniture, entirely ineffective by modern standards, but terrifyingly convincing in the context of Victorian imagination. You move along the hallway, glancing at each mirrored panel. Even now, the surface seems alive, absorbing what it sees, reflecting it back with a delay or distortion, as if teasing you. The idea that a mirror could hold memory seems quaint, yet somehow it makes sense in a world obsessed with moral cause and effect, where every action ripples across the household and the soul. The fear of mirrors after sunset, then, wasn't merely superstition. It was an amalgam of technology, psychology, grief, and etiquette. It is as though the Victorians built a universe in which reflection was morally and emotionally charged. They were trying to navigate the boundaries between self, society, and the unknown, and the mirror was always there, gleaming or shadowed, silent but insistent. As you pause before one last mirror in the corridor, you notice the dimmest shimmer of candlelight catch the edge of the glass. For a heartbeat, your reflection seems slightly delayed, your smile a fraction behind your movement. You shiver, remembering the old advice, better to cover the mirror than to tempt it. And so you step back, letting the hallway darken fully, leaving the mirrors to their quiet, watchful patience. The house is quieter now, almost unbearably still, as though even the walls are holding their breath. You drift down the narrow staircase, past the parlor that still smells faintly of candle smoke and lavender. Every mirror you pass glimmers faintly in the low light, teasing the imagination. And now you realize the Victorian fear of mirrors wasn't only about ghosts, etiquette, or psychology. It was about control. They wanted to govern every reflection, every glance, every shimmer of light, because mirrors reminded them that some things could not be tamed. Take the bedroom, for instance. In middle and upper-class Victorian homes, mirrors were carefully positioned opposite windows or lamps to maximize light during the day. But at night, that same reflective glory became unpredictable. Shadows stretched and warped. Reflections multiplied, and suddenly the room seemed populated with more than its human occupants. It's no wonder the advice manuals insisted that mirrors be covered after dark. A mirrored bedroom was, in effect, a hall of private phantoms. One mainstream fact: the Victorians were meticulous about bedroom furniture placement, especially for young women. Etiquette guides described exact distances from beds to mirrors, insisting that a direct line of sight could disturb the mind's calm. A mirror was considered too potent a tool for vanity or observation if left uncovered at night, capable of awakening anxieties that polite society preferred to suppress. Fringe tidbits add a richer texture. Some families practiced what was called mirror watching, an exercise in which a young woman would stare at her reflection until she felt it respond. Allegedly, the reflection could indicate health, fortune, or even spiritual state. In more extreme accounts, a mirror could warn of approaching death, a kind of supernatural barometer for those desperate to find meaning in daily routines. You imagine a young lady blinking in candlelight, waiting for a change in expression, and you can feel her nerves as clearly as your own. Historians still argue whether such practices were common or largely anecdotal, passed down through journals and letters. Either way, they highlight the extraordinary power attributed to mirrors, not as mere tools, but as intermediaries between the known and unknown, between self and society. You step closer to a tall, freestanding mirror by the bed. Its frame is dark mahogany, carved with floral motifs, curling leaves almost like little fingers reaching for the glass. You can feel the craftsmanship, the weight of intention behind its placement. It isn't just furniture, it's a repository of observation, etiquette, and subtle fear. By this period, mirrors had also become agents of beauty, tied intimately to the growing cosmetics industry. Women used them to apply powders, rouge, and oils, often under dim candlelight. Yet the very act of nightly inspection could produce anxiety. You imagine a delicate hand brushing back hair, noticing a faint shadow under the eye, wondering if that imperfection would invite gossip or worse, misfortune. Covering the mirror after sunset became a small but powerful shield, preserving both composure and peace of mind. You can almost hear a Victorian mother instructing her daughter, "Leave the glass, my dear, and sleep. The reflection will wait, but your rest cannot." It's simultaneously stern and tender, a recognition that mirrors, beautiful as they were, could be too revealing when the mind was tired, the body weary, and the candle flickering low. Some households even added extra rituals. A small sprig of rosemary might be placed on top of the draped mirror to sweeten the glass, a gesture meant to encourage benevolence from the reflection, whether spiritual or psychological. Others would recite brief prayers or affirmations, acknowledging that the mirror was an active participant in nightly routines, not merely a passive object. It is here, in these quiet, almost intimate practices, that the Victorian fear of mirrors after sunset reaches its full depth. It was a fear of the self, a fear of imagination, and a fear of forces, both seen and unseen, that the mind could not entirely control. Yet, it was also an act of care for the living, the dead, and the fragile boundary between them. You step back, letting your gaze linger just long enough to see the faintest shimmer of candlelight in the glass before retreating. The mirror remains, waiting and silent, a testament to the intricacies of a culture both meticulous and nervous, brave and cautious, rational and imaginative. The hallway seems endless now, each step echoing softly against the polished floors, the distant tick of a clock marking your slow passage. Mirrors hang at intervals, their surfaces dim in the faint candlelight, yet impossibly alive in your imagination. Tonight, you see that the Victorian fear of mirrors after sunset wasn't isolated. It was woven into nearly every aspect of domestic life, a silent rule embedded in furniture placement, etiquette manuals, and even social expectations. Consider the parlors where most visitors never lingered past dusk. Mirrors were arranged to create an impression of spaciousness, reflecting light and doubling the apparent size of the room. But when the candles guttered low, the same mirrors could make rooms seem crowded, their reflections multiplying shadows, movements, and flickers. What had been a clever optical trick by day became an uncanny presence by night. The Victorians, already cautious and methodical, interpreted this as a threat to composure and calm. Mainstream fact: etiquette guides consistently recommended that mirrors not directly face doors or windows at night. The reasoning was practical. If subtle, reflections might startle residents or guests, create confusion, or, in extreme superstition, invite restless spirits. You imagine the careful hands of a housekeeper tilting frames slightly, drawing black crepe over gleaming glass, making sure the space was orderly and secure. fringe beliefs take this a step further. Some sources describe mirrors as emotional mirrors, capable of retaining intense feelings expressed within a room. An argument, a shout, or even suppressed tears could leave traces in the reflection, supposedly influencing anyone who looked into the glass afterward. It's charmingly absurd, but emblematic of the era. Everything in the domestic sphere had potential moral or psychological consequence. Historians still debate how literal these interpretations were versus performative. Was the mirror genuinely feared, or was it a socially sanctioned way to express anxiety in a culture obsessed with propriety? Likely both. Victorians excelled at layering superstition, etiquette, and moral instruction into even the simplest household objects. You pause before a tall wall mirror, noticing the faint gleam of silver catching the last bit of candlelight. The reflection seems deeper than the glass alone, hinting at shadows just beyond your sight. Here's a quirky detail. Some Victorian families even consulted mirror reflections in the early hours of the morning, believing the distorted shapes could predict the day's fortune. Not ghostly spirits exactly, but moral and emotional omens interpreted with care and ritual. Science, too, played its part. Opticians of the day warned against staring at reflections for long periods, citing eye strain and nervous agitation. One 1875 pamphlet suggested that long exposure to candle-lit mirrors may disturb the equilibrium of nerves and mind. In other words, mirror-induced anxiety was both a psychological and physiological concern. You can see why covering them at night became a practical measure, blending superstition, etiquette, and proto-science into one ritual. By now, you're beginning to notice a pattern. Mirrors reflected light, but also reflected the inner life of a household. They magnified appearances, yes, but they also magnified anxieties, grief, and imagination. And at night, when shadows dominated and candlelight flickered, the reflection could appear almost autonomous. In more dramatic households, the ritual extended beyond mere covering. Some families would stop clocks, drape curtains, and even move furniture to minimize reflected surfaces. Mirrors were treated like participants in mourning, given respect and sometimes offerings. Small touches intended to pacify the object as much as the spirits it might hold. You trail your fingers lightly over the nearest mirror's edge, imagining its centuries of use and anxiety. Each streak, each polish, each covered night adds to the story of a culture deeply invested in the moral and emotional power of reflective surfaces. To the Victorians, the mirror wasn't just a tool, it was a companion, a judge, and after sunset, a minor adversary. And as you step back, letting the hallway deepen into shadow, you realize the genius of the practice. Covering mirrors at night wasn't merely superstition. It was a way to negotiate identity, emotion, and fear, all in one elegant, quietly terrifying domestic ritual. The house feels heavier, as if the walls themselves are leaning in, folding around you in the stillness of the night. You wander past the final corridor mirrors, noting the faint distortion of your own reflection. The play of candlelight makes your face appear older, younger, thinner, broader, sometimes all at once. By now, you're beginning to understand that the Victorian fear of mirrors after sunset wasn't simply about ghosts or superstition. It was about the delicate balance of perception, emotion, and control. You step into a bedroom where a full-length mirror dominates one wall. The frame is carved roses and vines, curling like slow, deliberate fingers. It's beautiful, almost tender, but you sense its weight. Mirrors were never mere decoration. They were moral instruments, psychological tools, and after dusk, silent arbiters of propriety. Their presence demanded attention, and their absence, or concealment, was a ritual of peace. Mainstream fact: the Victorian era saw an explosion in mirror production. Factories churned out sheets of polished glass coated with silver or tin mercury amalgam. A parlor mirror could cost a month's wages for a middle-class family, making it a prized object worthy of careful maintenance and cautious use. The investment alone added to the anxiety around mirrors. They were valuable, delicate, and morally potent. Fringe beliefs were more poetic. Some spiritualist guides claimed that mirrors could capture emotions like ink on paper, an argument for why coverings were necessary. If a heated argument, a tear, or an angry glance occurred in a room, the mirror might remember it and subtly reflect it back to the household, influencing future behavior. You imagine a young Victorian maiden hiding the mirror with black cloth after a quarrel with her sister, hoping to keep the reflection from gossiping silent. Historians still argue how common these practices were and whether they were literal or theatrical. Some suggest the coverings and rituals were primarily psychological, ways to manage fear, anxiety, or grief, while others see them as culturally codified superstition layered over practical advice. Either interpretation emphasizes the mirror's power as both object and symbol. The nighttime ritual extended to funerary practices. Mirrors were often veiled in rooms where someone had died. The logic was both spiritual and social. Spirits could become trapped in the reflective surface, and families were expected to maintain calm appearances. Covering mirrors prevented inadvertent exposure to restless presences, but it also provided privacy, a gentle boundary between the living and the dead. You note a small sprig of rosemary tucked into the mirror's drapery, a charm to encourage benevolence from the reflective glass. This act of care, part superstition, part psychological comfort, is emblematic of Victorian domestic life. Every object had a moral, emotional, or symbolic weight. Mirrors, in particular, were laden with subtle power, able to shape behavior, thought, and even dreams. As the candle guttered low, Victorians would sometimes practice what one guide called mirror mindfulness, briefly studying their reflections, noting imperfections, and then retreating to sleep. The goal wasn't vanity, it was a measured engagement with the self, a way to confront identity safely before darkness swallowed the room. You can almost hear the whispered advice. See yourself, but not too long. Let the glass rest while you rest. The candle finally dies, leaving only the faintest residual glow on the mirror. You can almost sense the room exhaling. Shadows stretch and merge, and your reflection, dim and uncertain, holds still. In that quiet, you recognize the genius of the practice. Covering mirrors after sunset wasn't just superstition, etiquette, or psychology. It was a comprehensive method for managing light, shadow, self-perception, and imagination. And you, standing here centuries later, feel the same gentle tension, the same delicate reverence. The mirror waits, patient and unblinking, a quiet witness to both history and imagination, a reminder that even objects we take for granted can harbor centuries of thought, ritual, and care. The house has grown impossibly still now. Even the wooden floorboards seem to hold their breath. You move slowly toward the last mirror in the top hall, a tall, narrow piece with an ornate frame curling like vines, reaching for a lost summer. Its glass is faintly tarnished with age, the silver backing a little cloudy, and as you approach, you feel that peculiar sense of anticipation the Victorians describe. The mirror is no longer just a surface. It is a participant, a subtle witness to your movements, your thoughts, your hesitation. By this late hour, the fear of mirrors after sunset reveals itself as a cumulative practice, a culture-wide negotiation with self, light, shadow, and imagination. During the day, mirrors were tools for grooming, social display, and illumination. By night, they transformed into instruments of reflection in a more existential sense, holding not only the image of a face, but the echoes of the household's emotional and moral life. Every glance, every gesture, every small lapse of propriety might be captured, magnified, and quietly remembered. Mainstream fact: the Victorians' fascination with mirrors extended into experimental science. Opticians and chemists studied reflective surfaces with increasing sophistication, producing ever larger, clearer, and safer mirrors. The mercury amalgam method, eventually replaced by silver nitrate, allowed families to bring reflection into homes in unprecedented ways. Yet the very improvements that made mirrors safer, larger, remain fact. The Victorians' fascination with mirrors extended into experimental science, producing ever larger, clearer, and safer mirrors. The mercury amalgam method, eventually replaced by silver nitrate, and more accessible, only deepened the anxiety surrounding their nighttime use. Fringe beliefs took hold in corners of society. Some guides suggested that if a mirror reflected a lie, it could retain the falsity and subtly influence the observer. Others insisted mirrors could store emotion, retaining traces of joy, sorrow, or anger. These were not widely accepted scientific claims, yet they persisted, whispered from mother to daughter, servant to maid, a form of domestic folklore intertwined with etiquette and moral caution. Historians still debate how widespread such practices truly were, and how much of the fear was symbolic versus psychological. What is certain is that the mirror in the Victorian imagination was never neutral. It was always active, moral, and occasionally capricious. In covering, draping, or turning mirrors, households created rituals of protection, self-regulation, and emotional management that persisted quietly. Night after night, you step closer, noticing again the faint gleam of candlelight on the glass. The reflection of your own face wavers slightly, distorted by shadows, as though the mirror itself breathes. You can almost hear the voices of centuries past, instructions whispered in quiet corridors, advice murmured at bedside, hands draping cloth over silvered surfaces, and the subtle warnings of etiquette guides and spiritualist pamphlets alike. In those moments, covering a mirror is not merely practical. It is protective, gentle, and almost poetic. The ritual guards sleep, nerves, composure, and imagination. It allows reflection to exist without overwhelming the observer, to maintain its dignity while quietly observing, holding its secrets. The act itself transforms fear into ritualized care, anxiety into contemplation, superstition into measured attention to the interplay of light, shadow, and self. And now, in the deep stillness, you understand the essence of Victorian practice. The mirror is simultaneously friend, judge, and companion. It teaches patience, attentiveness, and the quiet art of stepping back, allowing life to continue without interference, yet never forgetting the layers of observation, etiquette, and imagination that shape perception.